Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the briefing room. Yes, indeed, my name is Eric Kavanaugh. I will be your host for today's event. It's going to focus on one of my favorite topics, my friends, accelerating innovation, leveraging open source to optimize your shift left initiatives. We're going to have a panel discussion today, a little bit different than usual, but I'll be moderating a discussion amongst several interesting folks. We'll be talking to Joanna Schloss, Chief Technology Evangelist at Schloss Labs, as well as Thomas Boyles, Director of Platform Services at Schloss Labs, and our very own Everett Chucker, who just joined our team, the Senior Analyst here at the Bloor Group. He'll chime in occasionally with his own 2 cents about what's going on in the real world. So let me just go ahead and hand it off, first of all, and have Thomas and Joanna introduce themselves. So Thomas, welcome to the show. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what's going on at Schloss Labs.
Hi, thank you for having us. So I have been here at Schloss for 3 years, very experienced DevOps who decided to move into engineering management as a way to kind of have more influence over the situation and help people more. I look at the field as generally about trying to help people and make them happy, and it's part of my journey to expand that. And yeah, we're doing some very exciting things. We just bootstrapped a platform engineering team. It's focused on developer experience, how to get better flow through the whole system. So I'm kind of back in my, area of true expertise. And it seems to be going really well. So I'm really excited to be talking about this today with you guys.
Yeah, and so Joanna Schloss, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do over at Schloss Labs.
Sure. So I run the product marketing team here at Schloss Labs, and our mission is to evangelize and take to market all things SaaS. But my personal interest around technologies span the last 20 years, and I am an analytics enthusiast and a technologist at heart. And so for me, watching the maturity of DevOps and Agile and open source and big data and analytics has been a passion of mine for the last 2 decades. And I'm delighted to be here to have this interesting conversation to share with the world our practical and technical experiences that hopefully people can benefit from.
Yeah, and I'm really excited too, because what you folks do, you kind of remind me of BASF. If you remember those great ads that came out a few years ago by BASF, they would say things like, "We don't make the cooler, we make it cooler." And their whole campaign was, "We don't make a lot of the products you buy, we make a lot of the products you buy better." And in a way, that's what Schloss Labs is doing as a sort of foundational service provider. You're helping all developers everywhere get new code out faster, really focus on that DevOps side of the equation. And one of the themes that we'll kind of touch on throughout this program is open source. And so just very quickly, yours truly is a big fan of open source. I have been for a very long time. And you can see here some of the topic points we'll be talking about on the show today. So what is the link between open source and successful DevOps? And just for those who may not know, DevOps is really a fascinating trend in the industry, and it refers to developers and operations people, the ops folks, really tightly coordinating their efforts to get things out the door. So we used to have this big business IT divide we talked about. Now developers, by working closely with the business and also on the data side in something we call data ops, with those folks as well, we're starting to see much more real-time coordination, is I guess the way that I would put it. And that's wonderful news, because the bottom line is that consumers out there are very finicky these days, in part because of companies like Amazon, because of companies like Google, that have done such a good job at provisioning their services or their products that everybody else expects everyone else to do the same thing. So we'll talk about why open source technologies are often the missing link, quite frankly, between businesses struggling with their DevOps projects. And I like this shift left concept that we'll talk about too. And then open source to insulate your organization against risk. That's actually a pretty compelling storyline here. And we'll talk to both Joanna and Thomas, and also later with Everett about this. But, it was like 5 to 10 years ago that most organizations looked at open source as a risk in and of itself. You had CIOs and CTOs and senior level directors of IT saying, "No way in God's green earth I'm going with open source. Are you kidding me? That stuff's not good enough. It's not robust." Well, truth be told, it is. And open source really is the new de facto standard. So we'll also talk about the role and relevance of open source for different players in the DevOps world. So with that, let me just, tackle this first one. If you want to move to the next slide, we'll kind of dive into this. So strategic requirements. I guess I'll throw it up to Joanna first. What do you think about this concept of a decade of maturity? I think you're right on about that. And in particular, the last 5 years, I think have really solidified open source as a solid foundation for enterprise technology. What do you think, Joanna?
Absolutely. So I recently came back from a developer conference where I learned that even IBM, the software giant, hardware giant, services giant, has a commitment to the open source community. And the way they described it was that with developer relationships and the need for velocity to be ever increasing, they found that by investing in open source, they could retain the talent in that developer pool while testing out things in this open source community, while allowing the sort of slower moving part of the organization to continue to what I call do homework on the dev side. And it allowed this three-pillared approach to development where you had innovation on the edge while leveraging open source, while leveraging crowdsourcing, giving notoriety to those valuable developers that have creative ideas and allowing them to commit to the open source community, and all the learnings and the expertise that was being developed within that edge case developer community was being pulled back into IBM as a knowledge base. And I found it to be really interesting because only 10 years before, people were saying things like, oh, well, you know, as an established organization, we wouldn't use open source. And then on the other side of the fence, I was hearing things like, no more will there ever be any more ISVs, everything will be open source. And so we've clearly come back to a point where we're right in the middle. We have what we consider sort of slow moving giants adopting rapid paced development life cycles, and edge community crowdsourced projects, you know, moving back into IBM. So I'm delighted to see this sort of pendulum swing into the middle, because I think it's a very practical approach to innovation and sandboxing and experimenting.
Yeah, that's really
I
well
love
put.
that. Yeah, go ahead, Thomas.
Oh, I was just going to say, you know, like I've been reading, what is it, Jeffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm recently, and he talks a lot about how to get from, you know, like early adopter stage to middle and late adopter stage, and there's a lot of parallel in the way the whole perspective on open source software and specific projects have gone. I mean, you know, it's established now. People realize that it's usable, it's not going away. You know, like late adopters are willing to trust it, and Joanna's absolutely right. I mean, developers really want to be their best selves, and if you give them an opportunity, especially in a, you know, a big established environment like that, to contribute, to learn, to really kind of hone their skills and be on the cutting edge, you end up with happier developers. So it's a pretty important factor.
Yeah, it is pretty important. And I think that you guys are bringing up a number of really excellent points here. So I'd just like to kind of dive in a little bit, which is that to your comment, Joanna, you don't want one side of the pendulum or the other. You want to have a robust ISV market, but you want to have a solid open source foundation. And I think the real key, in my mind at least, for open source is that it is that foundation, and it's been slowly climbing up the stack. So I had thought about sharing some famous quotes from Linus Torvalds, because he has such a fun litany of humorous witticisms that he put out there over the years. But the bottom line is that he was the one who really started this whole crusade, in my opinion, and he threw down the gauntlet to Microsoft, which kept changing the operating system on everyone and thus pulling the rug out from underneath us. But now you see open source really climbing up that stack, and it's not just Red Hat, for example. There are lots of other companies out there doing things. Soft Labs is a big player in this space, but there are lots of others too, the Linux Foundation, for example, who are all really collaborating in a fairly tight and meaningful way to flesh out this foundation such that individual companies can really focus on their DNA, can focus on innovating on what makes them special, what differentiates them and their offerings from all their competition. What do you think about that, Joanna?
Yeah, that's why we continue to support that Selenium and Appium community, right? Because we realize that there's a lot of commonality that our development community is trying to support, but why serve that sort of build it once, use it once philosophy when you can apply it to the open source community and start to leverage everyone else's creativity and innovations and expertise. During the break, we were hearing about how Everin has all this automation experience, and he's like a perfect person where by participating in that community of open source committers, you get to take advantage of depth of knowledge that you might yourself not have as an individual. So I absolutely agree. It does open up that opportunity for expression.
Yeah, that's cool stuff. And I'll bring in Everin real quick just for your take on this, Everin. You've been in Silicon Valley for 24 years, or the Bay Area, really. And from your perspective, where are we in that pendulum swing, right? When you work with other developers and your colleagues over the years, do you feel that the open source virus has now really been fully absorbed by the development community? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's true. For the most part, I think we're on like sort of we're at the part of the swing where it smashes into the gong at the end of the pendulum. I think basically developers are all in because there's so many tools out there that are open source and they're kind of critical or useful. I think what might need to be the case is that the rest of the org needs to adopt that open source mentality and build it into their end to end, so that we look at the licenses beforehand, get approval to get the open source to allow the developers to use the open source, and then let them from legal and then run with it. So I think that's probably maybe one of the last pieces there that needs to be streamlined, but otherwise we're all in.
I love it. And Thomas, any last comment on you, and then next slide?
Oh no, I mean, I think you guys really have your finger on the pulse. If you go to things like the Kubernetes conferences, you see like really just like we've sort of hit like peak alignment, and it's pretty exciting because really powerful things are happening, but it's not compromising the sort of open and public and democratic nature of it.
Right. Okay, good. Next slide. We're going to talk about delivering on the promise of agility. So shift left. Joanna, explain what that means to your audience. I think this is a very interesting concept, and I think it sits right at the nexus of developers and business needs. What do you mean when you talk about shift left?
So what we mean when we talk about shift left, and what we observe in the industry, is that more and more requirements are being asked of developers. And this comes with this sort of an agile approach to development, right? The teams are smaller and they're more mindful of what they're doing. They're creating microservices, they're creating atomic pieces of code that then are asked for greater reliability, more frequent testing, and ultimately more frequent merges into the master branch or into the main branch. And so when we say shift left is we're seeing more of that responsibility go from a centralized perspective into a distributed perspective. I have many people at many large organizations where not only am I a developer that's required to come up with new and delightful applications, but I'm also required to build it, and I'm also required to build the tests that will test it. And in many cases, I'm actually required to test parts of it. Because that's the only way for me to ensure that my small contribution will seamlessly merge into that main line. So it's that shifting of the responsibility closer and closer to the innovation point, which is where I view as the developer as that master artisan, and they have more responsibilities today than they ever did before. And that's how we've been able to achieve agility in organizations like Facebook and LinkedIn and Yahoo and Google, right? You mentioned all these big major digital brands. The only way they can release as often as they can is that they're shifting their responsibility left and upstream.
Yeah, and so that's a really good point, right? Is upstream, and I love that metaphor, because if you think about things like application development or even data quality, data provisioning, really anywhere you look in the world of where business meets technology, when you use the term upstream, you're implying that you're solving a problem way at the top of the flow, if you will, which means everybody downstream can benefit from that. And that's important stuff because historically we've spent so much time and energy trying to solve problems at the pain point or where the pain is felt, and that's downstream. But the problem when you solve a pain point downstream is that, first of all, it's just a point solution. But second of all, you're kind of ignoring the bigger challenge, which really does emanate upstream. So I guess, Thomas Boyles, I'll throw it over to you. What do you think about that analogy?
Yeah, I mean, that's right on. The whole idea is to make it cheaper and faster and to keep your developers in a state of flow. And if you can put the feedback loop as close to them as possible, e.g. shifting left, you end up with a much better experience for everybody. And you don't want to be catching problems in a staging environment. You want that done on a laptop or an Integ at best. So it really helps guide the way you tool. It helps guide the way you train and onboard people. It's powerful.
Yeah, Everin, just quick comment from you. What do you think about that? Everin? We made a lot.
Maybe
Let's
we
go
lost.
ahead. Go ahead and push the next slide. All right, so managing risk and driving innovation. To me, this is a very, very interesting concept because, again, it used to be viewed, this whole concept of open source, as a risk unto itself, right? You wanted to have closed source software. You wanted to have complete control, even though most developers will tell you in the closed source world, you really didn't have as much control as you wanted to. You didn't have as much security as you wanted to. It's almost a mindset change that's required. But now, for a whole variety of reasons, I think that's changing. So, Joanna, first some commentary from you on why you feel open source helps mitigate risk more than create risk.
Yeah, it's a really interesting phenomenon, and that comes, I think, with the maturation of open source. Organizations are being forced to reevaluate the cadence of how they conduct business, right? Businesses describe themselves using that overworked term of agile, or being nimble, or being able to address the market in a really rapid pace. I recently talked with a company that's in a very competitive space where they have a consumer product. They're somewhat more of a boutique vendor approach. They're more regional, and they experience tremendous pressure from larger organizations. But they have this pattern in this marketplace where about a month before sort of the drop dead date, I don't want to reveal too much of who these players might be. A month before the drop dead date, the major players who tend to work a little bit more slowly and a little more a waterfall, like a fast waterfall, will release a preview of what they're going to deliver for that year's functionality. And this little company that has a pretty reasonable market share in their region and is trying to grow ever quickly, watch as the major vendors release their capabilities, and through their agile and open source culture adoption, they're able to very quickly, in 2 sprints, which is like 3.5 weeks, build the same capability, enhance it and increase it, and add their own flavor to it, and roll it out to their customer base and delight their customers and keep their customers and grow their customer base. And that can only happen when you have a foundation of open source tools that you can take advantage of, that you trust, and that you're delivering, as you said, Eric, business value closer at the source, right? They know what it is that they need to do. They find the technology that helps them do it quickly, and then they're able to meet the market needs before the market leaves them behind.
Wow.
And so
that's a great,
they're able to take these risks through open source without risking the core business. And they're innovating all along the way.
Wow. Thomas, thoughts from you?
Yeah, I mean, I love hearing stuff like that. I mean, that's kind of, we want to help enable that too. That's really one of the core features of what we do, and it is one of these things where, you have this great wealth of access to these tools that are really powerful, really well supported, big communities that really want them to be awesome. And by the way, like, if you want to walk it back and really see what everything does, you can do that because it's literally open source. It's as transparent as it gets. And back to the original point about, security and safety, like, transparency actually counterintuitively is one of those basic principles that helps you be safer and more secure in many, many ways. So pretty exciting all around.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think we got Evan back on the line now too. So I'll throw out this comment. I heard a really interesting perspective on open source, I guess a few years ago now, where someone talked about how open sourcing your technology in a very real and fundamental way preserves it for eternity. I mean, maybe not forever, because stuff does get lost from GitHub. Folks, be sure to back up your GitHub code. But the point is that if you open source it, then it's out there and it's in the real world forever for anyone to leverage. Evan, what do you think about that?
Well, definitely the record in GitHub is definitely a permanent one. I think that it's a good way for folks to make a mark in the software community by open sourcing projects. I've done so in the past, and it's just kind of a stepping stone to develop, having more developers come in and work on your app or software. And as far as mitigating risk, I think open source does so in several different ways. Namely, it gives developers multiple options for plugging in tools for particular parts of their, let's say pipeline. And should they want to, decide to move away from a particular tool they've chosen, there's other options out there that are readily available. So that's one of the risks that are mitigated. And of course, having your code be open and viewable, and have developers be able to review it and make commits against it and check it for any security risks, etc., definitely mitigates risk. So yeah, I would definitely agree.
Yeah, and I would add, I think Eric, or maybe it was you, Thomas, that talked about preserving. I also think of open source mitigating risk as a way of using innovation and the investment of innovation alongside portability. I don't think I said that very well, but the gist of it is when you open source something, it stays out there in all of perpetuity. If you use something in open source and you bring it into your organization as a foundational piece, it remains highly portable, right? It's not like you're locked in where when you might invest in years past when we might have used a piece of freemium software and that freemium software is deprecated by your vendor. And I'm not saying freemium is bad. I'm just saying it's one of those things where it's not as portable, right? Whereas open source allows our developers to innovate on top of the open source experience. And then if there's something that's really unique to their business or application, it's highly portable and it preserves that investment of time and energy and resources. And so in that way, it also de-risks that investment, which was, I think, very contrary to the original worries that people had around open source. They thought that everything would be given away for free and nothing would be kept of them behind a firewall. But I'm seeing practical applications where code lines are branching away from the original open source, but are maintained by other developers because they find it useful.
Yep. I'd like to amplify that too. It also ends up being an onboarding benefit and a hiring benefit. If you're using something that is ubiquitous, and everybody, like Selenium is a great example, right? Like, that you can walk into a shop being an expert at that technology, they're still using it. You can hit the ground running in a couple of days. And then even better, if you're looking for an expert in that domain, look at the open source community. You can shout at, different groups and say like, hey, developers here, we're looking for somebody with this skill. And you already have people that are highly enrolled, passionate, intrinsically motivated to do the work. There's a ton of social benefits.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. So I was also going to say, to Thomas's point, right, these people are encouraged to try, fail forward, and try again, right? Because every sprint allows us to evaluate what it is that they've adopted and see what the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? I run all of my retros like that, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And we learn from that, and that, again, allows us to be more nimble, right? Because we don't have a lot of time leverage when our customers are expecting new things all the time, right? The millennial MTV generation is merged into a very demanding community of consumers, right? Whether it's an application or a game or whatever it is, it's I want it now. Oh, no, wait, I wanted it yesterday.
Yep.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. And there's several other interesting benefits to open source in general. One of my favorite quotes or concepts is that with open source software, bad code goes away. And it's kind of like there's an old cliche, many hands make light the works, while many eyes make shallow the bugs. I think it's one of Linus Torvalds' comments. Now, there is a little bit of a challenge, I think, in that bad code goes away, but there's a sort of good enough for government work type factor that can come into play. And so you do have to focus on technology that gets hardened in the open source space. You get all these different projects, and they're at various levels of their maturity. And you do need to be careful about making sure that whatever project you're using is at the level of maturity required, or at least of taking the position that you're using these technologies in foundational ways, right? So the general idea, again, is that you have this solid foundation of proven open source code that gets the job done, and then you build on top of that. So with that, I guess I'll throw it back over to Thomas for any commentary.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important point. I mean, a lot of that comes down to judgment and experience. Like just because something is new and shiny doesn't necessarily mean you should use it. You should definitely let your people play around with it, but like you do want architects and experienced leadership taking a look at this, comparing it against the patterns they've seen in the past, deciding whether it's really something to invest in, and then again making room for people to just mess around and to play and to figure out, like, does it have a possibility? So yeah, there has to be a balance.
So Thomas, I have to ask, and I hate to put you on the spot, but you as an engineering manager, how do you make decisions on open source projects that were sandboxed, going from a sandbox position to a production position, or even sandboxing something and testing it out, and then deciding that you want to bring that technology knowledge in-house? Are there some best practices that you could share? Because I think this, again, de-risks that investment.
Yeah, there are. I mean, for one, you should definitely be looking at everything. Like, don't just shoot something down, like because it's new. To like really test it if you're gonna think you might want to go for it. Like we did a Kubernetes transformation here, maybe like a year and a half ago, like completely, and it was really scary for a lot of people. But the team that was running that pilot did it very, very carefully, and they really just kind of not only beat it up on all ends, but they tried to like really answer all the accusations that could be thrown at it. And by the time we were ready to go, like we were really ready to go because the people had tested out, had really good judgment. They had done all the work. We stepped into it very carefully, and we knew we had a way to step out of it too if we didn't like the results. So, I mean, it's kind of it's part of the craft though. Like you just have to like have a feel for that as well. And you have to have good people to be able to help you with it, because it's not something you should just dive into if it's going to be like a big deal, like the entire deployment platform. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah,
that's good stuff. So let's move on to our biggest, meatiest slide, which is up next. Yes, the role of open source in the DevOps world. So again, let's just take a step back. Let's go upstream in our minds a little bit and realize what we're trying to accomplish. And in the world today, the bottom line is that you need a robust platform upon which you can build out your applications, whether they be mobile or desktop applications or whatever it is that you're trying to do. And we are in this era of custom apps. I mean, if you think about how many apps there are across all these different devices, it's just mind-boggling. And there's really no stopping the innovation either on the hardware or the software front. So what does that mean? Well, it means a lot of things. Number one, you have to be able to dynamically test your app across all the different form factors that are out there in the world today. That's desktops, laptops, iPhones. We've got all these Samsung devices coming out constantly, and trying to do that kind of testing manually on this version versus that version, well, all I have to say is good luck. Let me know how that works out. I'm a head out, as we say in the meme world. It's going to be a problem. So you need to be able to dynamically manage that, and what you really, really want is this vision of continuous improvement, continuous integration, which you heard Thomas mention Kubernetes a minute ago. That technology stack really enables this whole next generation of very dynamic apps. I mean, I've seen several major software vendors now retool, refactor their entire technology stack to run on Kubernetes. That is a major, major sign, folks, that this is the direction things are going. Everyone I talk to in the industry agrees, yes, Kubernetes is the standard. Even folks who are competing against them are like, yeah, well, they did a pretty good job. So that's reality. But again, continuous testing, continuous integration, continuous improvement. We can't live in the waterfall world anymore. It's an agile world. You've got to have this in your organization if you're going to survive. Joanna, what do you think?
Oh, absolutely. And I think you said it very elegantly. And I'd like to take the answer to this question from a persona perspective. Thomas and I talk about this often, but DevOps and Agile and open source are all cultural shifts. It's not just about the technology, but rather a commitment to this cultural change. It brings a lot of different strategic opportunities for an organization and a lot of tactical levers that we can pull. But at the end of the day, I think in order for all of this to emerge as something that a business can culturally adopt, we have to be mindful of all the different stakeholders and personas that have an eye on this. And I think that one of the things that people forget when they're making these major cultural shifts is that for the developer and the practitioner and in our case for the SOS world, our SDETs and QAs, there is a inertia of a fear for change, right? You're moving me away from something that I'm comfortable with. And even though the open source piece looks really dynamic and interesting, it's still very scary for them. But at the same time, their leaders are really looking for them to become more and more agile every day and embrace the philosophy that they want to push through their organization. They're looking at open source as a vehicle or a tactic to do that. And I think that at the end of the day, what we've derived, the greatest lesson that we derive from an agile development lifecycle is this need to communicate. You can only achieve these cultural shifts and strategic initiatives and tactical changes by having constant communications, being mindful of everyone's personas and their interests and what it means for them. And I think that we forget that, right? We get excited about the technology. Managers get excited about the benefits or the promise of the benefits, and we leave the people that have to do the work behind because we don't realize that there is a fear in the change and in the cultural shift. So I think that in moving forward, that's something that most organizations that are fast waterfall or slow agile would stand to benefit from taking a step back and looking at how they can drive a cultural commitment to quality and a cultural commitment to the methodologies that they've selected.
Yeah, I love that. Thomas, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, well put as usual, Joe. Yeah, I mean, I think we've turned this into like a collaborative sport, you know, and the way the industry and the open source communities work, like, all really support that, and it just becomes this really kind of wonderful, open, generative experience, you know, like where I talk to people in other industries that, you know, have like more entrenched cultures, you know, like, and they're doing amazing stuff, but like they don't get this every day. Like when I talk about how my day-to-day goes, they're really surprised that it is like this fun and that it is this open and that you can just iterate so quickly and with such a high bandwidth of communication and transparency.
Well, and you know, here's a developer question for a developer. I'll throw this over to our engineer friend, Everin of Selchucker. You know, developers want to develop and have fun and to, on Thomas's point here, have some agility. They don't want to be bogged down in the muck, so to speak. They want to have the agility to try things and to play around with things, because you never really know how you're going to get it done until you start playing around with the code and seeing what happens, right? So I think that the importance of this foundation and how it enables agility is really quite powerful. What do you think, Everett?
No, I totally agree. So, I mean, basically the way it works is if you're a developer and you've got a certain set of tools at your disposal that have been purchased by the org. So that's basically the set of tools that you can work with and leverage if you don't bring in open source. And so you're kind of already limited. If you want to pull in another tool that's commercial, it's going to be a longer conversation with your manager and maybe upstream from there. And it's definitely going to take some time to get the purchase approved, get the licenses, etc. So opening, and then you know, so that basically slows the developer down. It doesn't make their life easier. It doesn't make them more efficient. It does the opposite, in fact. and it kind of doesn't make things very fun, so to speak. And so moving, into bringing open source into the picture, all of a sudden there's this, multiple taps to repositories that you can, and libraries that are just accessible, thousands, millions of them out there that you can access all of a sudden once you bring open source in the picture. So now you're free from, the chains and the bond that you're bonded to with commercial software, and you can kind of just run with what you like to do, which is write code and, integrate tools and implement software. And so it's day versus night, really, for a developer.
Definitely.
Well, yeah, Joanna, your thoughts on that, Joanna?
Yeah, I was going to add everyone's very insightful view, which is our developers today are very eager to share, right? We recently did a very robust developer survey, and the overwhelming sentiment for them was they are actually really excited about building things that other people will use and find useful. It goes beyond sharing, but rather I equate that to job satisfaction. I think of my developers as artisans. I would hate to be an artisan or a chef or someone who's creating something and you put it out there and nobody uses it. And I think that the open source community is that forum of both validation and exploration, right? Going back to the premise of this original talk, which is open source drives innovation while creating a less risky environment, right? So we all have the developers that we want to entice to stay. As Thomas had said, it's a really amazing way to grow your experience. But these artisans really want to build things that other people want to use. And what better way to ensure that your products and your ideas and your innovations are aligned with your business requirements than trying them out, trying them quickly, making sure that they're delightful by increasing their quality and their production readiness through a variety of tools, then for these developers to really feel like they have great job satisfaction. So I think open source is that vehicle for them to feel like every day I'm doing something that someone else will eventually want to use and explore.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Thomas.
Just to kind of bring it back around, like a lot of this gets into this like psychological concept of flow, and these tools really promote that. It just makes it an experience where you're just kind of jamming through the code and it's just fun. So well done.
Yeah.
Guys.
In fact, one of the greatest pitfalls that this developer research survey that I did, that developers self-identified, is context switching. And that's exactly to Thomas's point, right? Being in that flow zone, the open source library allows you to just keep on going, right? You don't have to pause to go and tap another group to get access to something, because the minute you start to pause, we all know what happens. You get distracted, and when you get distracted, you lose that momentum, and it takes a while to come back to it. So
yeah,
keep telling other people.
Go ahead, Thomas.
Joanna, please keep telling other people that. The world needs to hear that.
Well, I'm going to tell a quick story here, right? Which is, and Everett, I'll have you just kind of comment on this in a second. But I was talking with Everett about this whole movement in Silicon Valley in the last 2 years. It was probably like 3 years ago this happened. I won't name any names, but there was this whole movement of bringing everybody back on site. Oh, we can't have you all working remotely anymore. We have to be all here together, et cetera. And there is that mindset among certain senior managers and senior executives, with the idea being, oh, this way we can all collaborate. And Everett joked to me one time about how he's seen that himself. He's had the demand to get the developers into the main office, et cetera. And he says, and it never fails. The second you put on your headphones and get ready to just go into that zone, to go into the flow that Thomas talked about, what happens? Someone taps you on the shoulder. Oh, we wanted to talk to you about X, Y, Z. And the flow is gone. Right, Everett?
Oh yeah, that's a true story that has happened many times to myself, and I'm sure many other developers can relate to it. It's almost comedic. The flow is a real thing. I mean, you get in the zone and you start coding. And once and if you get interrupted, then guess what? That's going to be a bug, or it's going to be delay in delivery. So yeah, I mean, as far as distributed teams go, I think that it's kind of funny how folks want people in the office so that it can distract them intensely and ask them questions. And in startup world, in the earlier phases of startups, and stealth mode and Series A, that kind of thing, that's kind of important to have folks right there. But then when you're talking about Facebook trying to have developers sit in a bus for an hour and a half because they have to have people down in Menlo Park. I invite them to continue doing that because that gives us more developers from around the world to choose from to hire a great talent from. And some of the best teams I've seen are distributed teams, and they are rock stars. They're like top engineers from alumni from YouTube, etc. And they can knock it out of the park better than 99% of the other people. And they're on distributed teams. And yeah, so they decide when their flow is going to be interrupted because they, work out of their home office in Colombia or in Spain or wherever. So yeah, eventually we'll go that direction where developer flows is guided by the developers themselves, but right now it's kind of not. And so yeah, hopefully one day there will be more flow.
Yeah,
I have a story.
Yep, go ahead, Thomas.
Oh, so the previous shop where me and one of our better developers came from, we had an open office, and it was right in the midst of like total chaos. And one of our friends complained so much about being randomized and bothered that we went and bought a velvet rope and put it around his desk.
That's funny. Funny.
Yeah.
I've
actually been in offices in New York City where the sales teams and engineering teams are in the same room, and the sales guys are on con calls throwing footballs over the engineers' heads. So, but that's New York. It's not too far from Silicon Valley.
Yep. Super cool.
Yeah.
And I would say that with open source, Thomas really talked a lot about this flow idea. And for those of us who think of, from my perspective, the flow is enhanced because you have a platform that allows you to access all the pieces all at once. And for myself, having been an engineer, I know that if I have to navigate away from my environment, whether it's a testing environment or a coding environment or even just a debugging, brainstorming environment, if I have to move away from that, it breaks up my flow. And I am like the dog in that Up animated film. I am immediately distracted, right? And so I feel like we all have a little bit of that. And so with this whole continuum of tools within your environment at your fingertips, at the ready, it really inspires more flow and portability. And then with our agile motions, super communicative developers can achieve a ton regardless of where they're sitting and at what time they're doing their coding.
Mm-hmm.
So I think all of that is
this is good. I just want to throw one comment in here, and it's kind of critical. So everyone alluded to this or he commented on it, that the best engineers, the rock stars out there, can achieve something 10 times, 100 times faster than someone who is not all that good. And that's because coding is not like masonry, right? With masonry, you have a set pattern where you put one brick here, then one brick here, and it all kind of fits together in a predetermined and understood pattern. That's not how code works. And you have to remember that the code is written in languages. These languages are all different in various ways. They do have similarities. But there's a certain art to the side of coding. It's not just science. Thomas, do you want to comment on that real quick?
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting point. And I think it's one of the factors in why software tends to be a little more meritocratic. You don't have to have some very rigid education to do it because there's lots of different ways to get the job done. And I can tell you from being a hiring manager, I've got probably 5 different kinds of mindsets that are just excellent developers at the same time. And if you watch them actually do their work, it's all extremely different. And a lot of these people are self-trained, and that wouldn't be possible if it weren't for the flexibility and how cheap it is and how just much support there is for kind of learning it on your own and diving in. And that's really different. And by the way, that also opens up a lot of possibility because you're not just getting the creativity and the uniqueness of different cultures, you're making room for different mindsets to come in and play and be as productive and as well respected. And it just makes it more generative and positive, which is very cool. It's really inspiring to see that. And I'm glad you brought that point up because not many people talk about that.
Right. No, it is important. It's good stuff. Well, I know we want to get to at least one more slide here, so let's tackle this next issue of the next decade. It's so hard to predict. Yeah, just very quickly, it's so hard to predict what's going to happen 5 years ago or from now, rather, as opposed to 10 years from now. But just quick thoughts from each of you on what you see coming down the pike. First, Joanna, and then Thomas, and then Everett.
Sure. So what do I envision as the future of open source? I see open source turning into more and more what I would call libraries of content, and some of it will be partially proprietary, some of it will be totally open, and some of it will look more like a vendor offering than anything else. And I think it's that diversity of options for our consumers that will drive this motion of it's like almost like the opposite of commodity. It becomes more and more disparate and more creative, and more developers are encouraged by their organizations to contribute because of the benefits of both portability and permanence and crowdsourcing. That I don't remember hearing the word crowdsourcing for a while, but that concept of crowdsourcing your code line and taking advantage of people that might not sit next to you. And I see that becoming almost like a universe unto itself, even more than it is today. So, and being accepting of all the different flavors of how code gets developed.
Yeah, Thomas?
No, yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And like I mentioned attending the Kubernetes conferences and some of the stuff that was going on with Cloud Native. Big players are putting a lot of energy into like public projects like Istio and I mean Kubernetes is another great example. And those things have matured at an amazing rate. I mean they've gone from being like early Linux to current stability Linux in a matter of years rather than decades, and that wouldn't have happened without huge buy-in and huge belief. And by the way, the people that get to work on this stuff are just in love with it. They're actually making their developers' lives better. They're bringing joy and kind of fundamental like brain pushing stuff to the community as well. So it's a really exciting time to be around.
Yeah, I think so too. I think again we're at this really interesting inflection point in the evolution of open source as a community. And there have been some hiccups along the way. Folks who have listened to my webinars and radio shows know that I became a bit disenchanted with some of the bickering between some of the bigger open source vendors, not to name names, but Cloudera and Hortonworks, which have now merged, which is very amusing because they were like fierce enemies. And now it's like, now we all work together. So with that, just a quick comment from Everett on the future of open source the next 2 years. What do you see, Everett?
Yeah, so I think we're sort of already in the heyday of open source. So I think what will happen is that some of the things that are currently going on with open source will get better. I mean, so adoption will grow quickly, continue to grow. Support for open source will continue to grow, and integrations will be more streamlined between different open source products. Documentation and community will also continue to sort of grow, and somehow I think that there's going to be some way to some developments that bring more developers into the open source community, both from adoption standpoint as well as contributing to open source and streamlining that. And then, so obviously I think licensing will continue to sort of hopefully make things easier for developers to work with open source, and as well as probably not a great thing, but I think there'll continue to be land grabs and anti-competitive moves in the open source realm as well, some along lines that we've seen. So, but I think that it's we're in a great spot, and I will also add that I think that one of the big things that will probably continue to go on is that open source will start to outpace closed source in terms of the release cycles and cadence, and so hopefully that will mean that they will be providing better products than closed source going forward, as they already do in many cases.
Yeah, that's actually. Go ahead, Tyler.
I wanted to agree with that. Like most of the stuff that we're using right now is open source, and it's a much faster release cycle. It tends to be more stable, and there really aren't proprietary competitors that are even keeping up with their feature sets and quality. So
good stuff, and that's actually a perfect segue, that last comment from both Thomas and Everett, to our next slide here. So let's move that. And Joanna, I think you wanted to kind of talk about how soft labs can help, and let's face it, making testing fast, reliable, and easy throughout the software development process. That's a big deal, right, Joanna?
Absolutely. So we've touched on topics like the flow, software lifecycle, the software development life cycles. We talked about agility and DevOps. And the interesting thing around all this is for at every point and at every junction in these cycles and these processes is a component of reliability and how our developers are inspired to deliver ever more reliable code. And Thomas mentioned that now, like open source code is now more reliable and more secure and more dependable. And a big part of that is, again, that shift left concept that more and more people are being asked to test. And it sounds really funny that something as simple as testing or quality assurance or guaranteeing that my code will work continues to percolate up as a culprit of a blocking factor. And so here at Sauce Labs, what we do is we endeavor to make that entire process of testing and guaranteeing that what you're providing to the rest of your org is flawless, right? That's the ultimate goal. I hear from some of my developers is that they strive to contribute green releases, right? Things that have no blockers, things that just work because they are, amazing. But that doesn't come from a one and done, right? Like essay writing takes a lot of iterations, just like coding takes a lot of iterations. And that's where we make getting the quick results out in an iterative fashion better. So the next slide really talks about the journey that we have seen our customers on. Scott, can you advance the slide for me, please? This infographic shows the culmination of many of our customers, many hundreds of our customers are on this continuous testing journey with us, and on their own as well. This is not specifically sauce, because if you look at the milestones that we've identified for these customers, they're fairly generic. We realize customers experience this process in some shape or form. We've depicted it as linear, but really it's much more cyclical than it is linear. And it comes down to 4 major milestones, and that is the commitment to a culture of quality, a strategy that allows our organizations to be agile, while innovative, while disciplined, at the ability to share, communicate, and be effective at their jobs. Then there's always the hard work of implementing the culture and the strategy. And when you get across the chasm of having implemented the culture and strategy, then you can really start to move, right? And that's the scale idea, where a technology solution like Sauce Labs can really help you parallelize things, create multi-threaded experiences, run multiple Scrum teams all at once, because you're able to pull in that testing motion whenever and wherever you need, whether you're shifting left with a headless experience or you're shifting left with component-based testing on visual components, testing your component library early and often, or whether it's just understanding how you've changed the way your front-end application is performing based on the complexity of these single-page applications or even multi-page applications. So that scale occurs, and then ultimately you learn from it, because we're all driving towards an agile experience where we're doing retrospectives to learn from it. We're able to optimize, and then we're able to feed back into the system, and it starts over again. And so this journey of CI/CD with continuous testing is being adopted by many organizations all around the world. And at the end of the day, we see a lot of customers very successfully traversing this journey in a repetitive and really revealing my age, a DSS experience, a decision support experience, where we make decisions based on information to improve what we did before and enhance the entire software development lifecycle. And so here at Sauce Labs, we endeavor to help you enhance your experience and ultimately delight your customers and deliver flawless apps. So that's kind of where we are today. And I think we only have 4 minutes before the channel closes, and so I'm happy to take a couple of questions if possible. Otherwise, the replay will be available, and our bio slides have our Twitter handles if you want to reach out to my esteemed colleague Thomas Boyles, and everyone can be reached on the Bloor Group, and I myself am also available on Twitter at Joe Schloss. So we'd look forward to hearing from you or answering questions or having more dialogues around our passions, which are open source, agile development, and ultimately delighting our customers.
Yeah, that's fantastic stuff. I really love the robot in the middle there, crossing the chasm there, holding it all together.
Yeah, that's
but
Soft
I love it. I have two robots, Evan. Right?
That's right.
Everin's nephew has a cute little concept. Not to get too personal, but he came up with the theory that everyone has a robot. He met me just recently, and he said, "You have two robots."
He just assumed Eric had two for good reason.
That's funny.
This is good stuff. But no, the point is that we do have this chasm, and we do need to manage it. And we had a great comment from an audience member here who just writes, "So true on the flow comment. I've seen some companies mix sales and dev together in the name of cultural mix, which turned out to be a bad idea." So, everyone was kind of musing about having the sales team in the same room with the developers, and literally the sales guys are throwing footballs over the heads of the developers because they're just having fun doing their thing. Or, the other thing you'll hear sometimes is, shocker, salesperson overcommitting on something to make a sale. That makes the developers nervous because they're the ones who have to deliver when push comes to shove. But I think the general message here, and I'll throw it out maybe to Thomas for a final comment, is that cultures are definitely difficult to change, but I think what you need to do is just really understand the priorities and the roles and get people in the room together when it's appropriate to do so, and then let people do their thing when it's appropriate to do that. Right, Thomas?
Yeah. I mean, you want to create an environment and a culture where they can be their best selves, and that's also with great respect to salespeople. I'm sure we're no fun to work around, so but yeah, you want people to be able to win, and these tools help them win. And getting into it for real and really committing to it is a great way to change your culture. So
yeah, that's a really good point. And folks, let's just remember, we're all good at different things. Every person has their own unique set of skills. There are the polymaths out there. There is the jack of all trades. I heard an interesting stat recently that a theory is you're going to have more IT generalists coming down the pike in the future because of the democratization of functionality that cloud brings. So just when you thought we were going into the age of specialization, someone comes along and says, actually, we're going back to the age of generalization. But it is going to be a mixed bag of those two different things, right? You're going to want to have, to Everett's point, your full stack developers who are the rock stars. You're going to want to have the salespeople who sell stuff. Without that, you're not going to do any business. You're going to be out of business. But you want to have the right people talking to the appropriate counterparts as and when needed, just like DevOps. You want the developers and the operations people talking to each other, but you want an audit trail of what they did and what data they used. That's data ops. But underneath all of that, underneath every last bit of what we're talking about, every last piece of innovation in the app world, in the enterprise world, you have testing. You want to test that stuff, make sure it works, because if it doesn't work, you're going to have an unhappy customer, and that's called customer churn. And with that, folks, we're going to bid you farewell. Thank you so much. As Joanna said, all these webinars are available afterwards, usually very shortly afterwards, now that we're with GoToMeeting instead of WebEx. And with that, we're going to bid you farewell, folks. Thank you so much for your time. We'll talk to you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.